It's now time for that big conversation that we promised you early on. Now, we know that last month on the 24th of June, the leader for the Movement for Change and Alliance for Revolutionary Change launched the GTP. All right, the Great Transformational Plan. Now, since the launch of this plan, there's been a lot of talk in the media, questions have been asked, and so on. Today, we're hoping to get all the answers to the questions and some great details and insight into the GTP and how it will come and introduce this transformational change that we have been told about. So it has 6 major clusters, which we will go into, from economic infrastructure, governance, to environment and science. My favorite one is behavioral change. And I'm hoping that all our questions will be answered today. Ladies and gentlemen, joining us live in the studio now is the man himself, Honorable Alan Kyerematen. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Great to have you.
How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. You're welcome to the show. Welcome back.
Thank you very much.
Yes, we had you not too long ago.
You already sound like a convert because you're talking about the clusters in a way that blows my mind.
Well, I've read a document over and over again.
Oh, you have?
I have.
And this is great.
Well, I think it is a very well-authored document.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate it. I've been telling friends and foes alike that the beauty of this document is that it is both a technical document and a political document.
Okay.
And it's very easy to read. And if in your own leisure time, you take your time and then read through it, you could be the next finance minister.
I tell you, the language is pretty simple, and
yes,
I can't help but wonder.
It's action-oriented.
Yes.
You know, yeah.
I can't help but wonder how long it took you to prepare this document.
That's a secret.
It's a secret.
When you come onto my cabinet, you'll get to know.
Oh, are you going to give me a position?
You know, I'm looking for young, dynamic. But the reason why I'm impressed is that I was surprised that you were able to talk about the clusters, and you know, it means that you've done your homework.
Yeah, I have done.
And that's what is important.
Well, I'm hoping that.
Are you applying?
Well, if you offer me a position, I'll take it under advisement.
Why not?
So I was hoping that we could go into some of the clusters.
Oh, yes, very much.
And then get some details and explanations on how you hope to achieve some of the plans you have laid out.
Yeah,
so from reading the document, it's not a manifesto, is it?
It's not a manifesto, but first, now let me say this so that I can put it in an appropriate context.
Okay.
You know, where we are now as a country, we are at a crossroads. And it's very important for all of us as Ghanaians to think beyond our allegiances to political parties. We're at a point where the country is so polarized and so divided that it's not sustainable. Every issue is politicized. It's NDC, NPP. Are we serving the interests of political parties, or we are interested in securing the future of our country? So what you need now is an independent, honest broker who can reconcile the two feuding parties, who can bring the country together, who can create a platform for uniting our country. Because let's face it, the bottom line is that a divided army cannot stand. So for me, it's very, very important. I think it should not be that, oh, Alan wants to be president. Yes, I want to be president. I'm a politician, and God has endowed me with so much that I believe that I need to contribute more to the survival of our country. Okay. But it goes beyond that. It goes beyond my ambition. We need to bring the country together. And secondly, also, we need to go beyond what traditionally has been the party manifestos. That's what you were talking about. You see, manifestos in political literature are intended to provide a sense of aspiration.
It's a catalogue of promises.
It's a catalogue of promises.
Yes.
And I want to stabilize the currency. How do you do it? That's the most important thing. And I think where we are now, with the crisis that we find ourselves in, we must go beyond this catalogue of promises. And that's why I talk about a plan and not a manifesto. And when you raised it, I thought I
needed to clarify.
To clarify.
Okay,
yes.
so this is a plan.
It's a plan.
But traditionally in our politics, we have held leaders accountable to the manifestos they present to us.
Yes.
So shall we hold you accountable to this plan that you're presenting to us?
Absolutely. In fact, that is why I've taken the time and also I have the courage to put up such a comprehensive document well ahead of the election. And we have two traditional parties who have been in office for 32 years that's put together. Now, one would have expected that 4 or 5 months into an election, one would have expected that these two parties would already have been out with their manifestos to give an indication as to what else they can do if they are brought into power. You see, it hasn't happened. They are still working on it. But
you have taken the lead.
I've taken the lead.
All right.
And I think it's very significant.
Yes, it's something that we should applaud you for,
yes.
I must admit. Now, I want us to go into the document.
Okay.
I've heard you speak on the economic cluster and also the governance cluster and social services a few times,
yes,
but I haven't heard much on the mindset and behavioral change cluster.
Yes.
Now, just looking at the document, at 6.5, you talk about the arrogance of power.
Yes.
And that struck me. The arrogance of power. So just to read the first paragraph, it says, this is a major obstruction to the progress in our country. Positions of authority must not be used capriciously. Leadership is an opportunity to serve the people and not to lord over them. And then you go ahead to list how you hope to address this challenge, the arrogance of power. Can you speak to it? Where did it come from?
You know,
what were you thinking when you put it in the plan?
If you are called to serve in government or in any political position, my understanding is that first you have to do so with a sense of commitment to the people who have put you there. And when we talk about arrogance of power, it means that even when you're doing the right thing, it has to be done in such a way that you carry people along with you. It doesn't matter what you can do. It is how you do it. And it's how you get people to believe in what you're doing. Because you're doing it for people.
Yeah.
And that's where the arrogance of power comes in. And I've distilled this element of arrogance of power because when you have two dominant parties, that's a duopoly, which is what I've been talking about, there's a sense of entitlement. Oh, I mean, I'm here, and the tradition has been that whether I do well or not, I'm likely to stay in for at least 8 years. That is part of what breeds that arrogance. And this must stop. This must stop. People need to hold you accountable, even if you are in power for one day. And there has to be a sense of humility that comes with serving. So we are looking for servant leaders. And that's where the arrogance of power
Well, they say that
in.
power corrupts.
Yes, but part of the challenge also is that, and I'm now talking to Ghanaians because eventually they make the decisions.
Yes.
Every country deserves the leaders that they finally get because you vote them into power.
Yes.
When people are going to vote, they need to interrogate the lifestyle and the disposition and the character of the people that they are voting for. It's not just what they say. And many people who come up to stand for elections are people who generally have been around. So it is possible to know the kind of people that they are. And that is why if we interrogate and audit their character and their disposition before you vote for them, you know whether this man is a humble man or not.
Okay.
And so part of the responsibility also lies on those of us who vote for people to come into power.
Okay.
That is very important. The arrogance of power limits your capacity to do what you are supposed to do.
Okay. I just had to ask you about that because I found it to be a very curious point.
Yeah, but now the reason why I'm also impressed about the fact that you are highlighting this behavioral and mindset change is that there are 6 clusters. Yes, we are in economic crisis. So it is understandable if people want to focus on the economy, on infrastructure, on health and education. But as you've rightly done, is the mindset change that would open up the opportunity for us to do all the other things in the other clusters.
Yes.
So you're on the right track.
Thank you. I'm glad you think so. Now, I want us to talk about vulnerable and marginalized groups, women, children, people living with disabilities, and so on. Now, it's great that you highlighted them in your plan. And I think it's also great that you speak about, when you talk about health, you talk about a minister in charge of mental health as well. I think that's a super thumbs up to you.
Yes.
But on marginalized groups and vulnerable people, we haven't seen as much, if you like, policy direction towards marginalized people in our country for a very long time. For example, buildings are not friendly to people living with disabilities. Women have been asking for extended maternity leave. Men are asking for paternity leave. People with disabilities who used to work, for example, at the toll booths are now back at home with no jobs and they're crying for help. There's so much that needs to be done for these groups of people. Can you just shed more light on what exactly you hope to do to bring hope to these people and solve some of these problems that they have hammered on over the years?
Yes. Now, when you have the power to govern, your biggest weapon is policy making. People don't realize that. So if you want to affect and change the lives of people with disabilities, then it is only through policy that this can happen. You need the kind of policies that will allow you to take the action that is required to better their lives. And that is why, and I'm happy now you are treating this like the gospel of Alan. That's what I've been saying. Because like a Bible, you should know where to read, which verse to read. So here, if you look at my policy solutions or prescriptions on the vulnerable and the people with disabilities, it says that review and strengthen existing social safety nets, program, etc. And it's very important that we review the existing programs, because I'm sure every government will tell you, oh, but we have programs for people with disabilities, But how far has that gone in responding to their needs? And you have to start off by looking at what is before you can look at what else needs to be done. So the review is very important. Second point talks about enforcing existing regulations for the payment of percentage of the District Assembly Common Fund to people living with disability. Can you imagine that there's existing regulation that requires PWDs, that's people living with disabilities, to have a certain percentage of the District Assembly Common Fund? But ask me whether it's ever paid to them.
Is it?
That's what this is about, that we have to enforce that legislation. Even if there are other areas where payments from the Common Fund is still not going, at least because of their vulnerability, PWDs deserve to be paid what is due them from the District Assembly Common Fund. Third, it talks about providing incentives to the private sector for the construction and operations of facilities that are accessible to PWDs. And you were talking about building installations in Ghana. There are many public and private installations that do not provide access to people with disabilities.
Yeah.
So it's a question of the kind of policy mix that you have to deal with the challenges of people. Because disability is not inability. And we must all understand that it can happen to anybody.
Okay.
And it's just appropriate that we must have policies that address their
What
needs.
about women?
Women.
So women are asking for policy on extended maternity leave.
Yes.
It's currently 3 months. It's highly inadequate. And we know that when women are unable to care for their children at that early age, it affects them subsequently.
Yeah.
They are unproductive at work because the whole time they're getting calls about the baby at home. They're probably thinking about the baby. Most organizations do not have nurseries. You cannot bring the child to work. And so this is something that we're asking for. Also, while we are on the topic of women, do you have any plans of implementing any policy on how many women we should have in both or one of your two houses that you have proposed, Parliament?
Yes, I've already made a commitment that at least 50% of my cabinet and all senior government positions will be assigned to women.
All right.
And this is not for purposes of just token representation. I believe a lot in the capacity and capabilities of women. You know, in the 90s, I used to run a program to develop companies that have high growth potential.
Okay.
It was called the Empretech program.
Yeah.
And when I started, I knew ordinarily women may not feel empowered to join the program because I was looking for for people with high growth potential who are already in business.
Okay.
Now, so knowing that women would not naturally join the program, I decided to proactively identify women myself and then encourage them to join.
Okay.
And the interesting thing is that before one enters into the program, we score them on 10 critical requirements for being a good entrepreneur. Can you believe that the women who came into my program scored higher than the men in 9 out of the 10 competencies?
Well, I do believe that.
They scored 9 out of 10 higher than the men.
Okay.
The only criteria where the men scored higher than the women and where most of the women actually got next to nothing was on risk-taking.
Okay.
So you can imagine that ordinarily women would even do much, much better than men in business.
Okay.
Only if they can deal with this element of risk-taking.
Okay. Now,
And so sometimes it's affirmative action.
okay.
And that's, you need to give opportunities specifically to women.
Deliberately.
Deliberately. It has to be intentional.
Yeah.
I know there are women who are gender activists who don't believe that that is the way to go. But I feel that you are opening up opportunities for women to show what they can. So I've already made that commitment.
And on maternity leave?
Yes, on maternity leave, it's very obvious.
Okay.
I mean, everybody who has a family, and I believe everybody has a family, would appreciate that this is something that it's important not just for the well-being of women, but also for families.
So what will you do?
No, but we can, my proposal is to go beyond the current period that is extended.
3-month regime.
Yes, 3-month regime. And the reason why I say so is that most women would like to stay at work until it is absolutely critical and that they have to go into labor, unless they have challenges with their health. So when they've stayed, at work for that long, until such time that they go into labor, then they need a longer time to heal and then also to stabilize before they come back to work. So that's why I would support any proposal to extend the period that they have post-birth.
Nice.
Yes.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much for saying that. Now let's talk about the economy, shall we?
Yes, please.
So according to your plan, you aim to reduce Ghana's budget deficit to 5%. Now, that's great. It sounds very ambitious. It's great if it's possible to do this. But how do you plan to achieve this, especially considering some of the reforms that you intend to bring? For example, in establishing a second house, a second parliament.
Yeah.
That sounds really expensive.
Yes.
How do you hope to achieve this 5% budget deficit while implementing such expensive reforms?
Yeah, excellent. First, let's look at how you balance your budget and how you maintain stability in your economy. I have 11 different entry points into that, and that's what I've explained in the gospel. First, there's
The gospel.
Yes, first there's expenditure management and control.
Yes.
If you do not manage your expenditure, then you can only sustain your economy by borrowing. Because if you don't have enough income to support your expenditure, then you have to borrow to finance your deficit. And that's not sustainable. So I have specific solutions for managing our expenditure. Then you have to be able to optimize your revenue. Once you have more revenue, then you can spend more. And so revenue optimization is also very important. You need to lower your taxes, because if you don't lower your taxes, it means that you are helping the economy itself to be what they call subject to high inflation. Because, taxes contribute to the cost of production.
Yes.
And with higher taxes, prices would definitely go up. And that is a major disincentive for consumers. Because when you have higher taxes, you reduce the purchasing power of individuals.
Yes.
So you need to bring your taxes down.
And I see you're planning on scrapping some of our taxes and levies.
Yes. Yeah. So you've actually read this.
Yes, I have.
So I am proposing the lowest tax regime in the whole sub-region of
But
ECOWAS.
doesn't that work against shoring up revenue if you're lowering taxes the way you plan on doing?
So you remember, I've talked about revenue optimization. So whilst you optimize your revenue and you reduce your expenditure, then you can sustain a lower tax regime. Because there are other ways of raising revenue, and not just through taxes. And so they all go together.
Okay.
They all go together. A lower tax regime will make companies more competitive.
Yes.
If they are more competitive because of lower taxes, then you actually will get more taxes. You get more revenue. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
Okay.
I hope you understand
okay, I understand,
the economic logic.
But
yeah.
I'm tempted to ask, so while this sounds great, considering our current state with the IMF, the conditionalities that come with the IMF facility that we took, it has become necessary, or so we have been told, that some taxes are increased so that we can be able to raise enough local revenue to meet up with, the conditionalities that came with the IMF loan. So would lowering taxes not work against this?
No, it will not. In actual fact, what happens with the IMF when they are negotiating with any country for a bailout package, you identify your own sources of revenue, which obviously would include taxes or tax revenue. But they cannot dictate to you what type of taxes you need to raise to be able to increase your revenue. You are at liberty to decide how you raise your revenue. Now, in my case, I have provided very progressive solutions for raising your revenue.
Okay.
Or, for example, if you deal substantively with corruption, you block leakages that lower your revenue base. And so once you are able to save money from dealing with corruption, then you don't need necessarily now to impose taxes, because you impose taxes to increase your revenue. But if your revenue is going out of your account because of corruption, then the matter is to stop the leakages by dealing with corruption. It is not complicated.
So
let's say you are earning 1 billion Ghana cedis by imposing taxes, because you think it's the easiest way to raise revenue. Meanwhile, you are losing that revenue through corrupt practices. So if you stop corruption or you reduce the incidence of corruption, then you retain more of the revenue, and then you don't need to increase your taxes.
So basically, if we had a better hang on corruption and corruption-related activities, we wouldn't have had to increase taxes to meet up to our IMF conditionalities.
Yes, that's one way.
Okay. So the current government sort of flawed.
Oh, yeah, they flawed in so many ways, not just on that one. You see, because we went to the IMF because our debt is not sustainable. Mm-hmm. And our debt is not sustainable because we were spending more than we were earning. You see, because if you are spending more than your revenue, then the only way to balance your budget is to be able to borrow. Now, if you borrow to a point, then your debt is not sustainable. It means that you cannot service your debt. And once you cannot service your debt, then you run into problems. So, for example, at the initial stage when we went to the IMF requested us to give an indication of our current debt to GDP ratio. So what is the ratio of your debt to GDP? Now, we were calculating our debt to GDP at that time around 70%, 75%. Now, when the IMF started interrogating our books, then they realized that there were other, what they call contingent liabilities, other debts, which we were not treating as debt on our books. And we needed, they wanted us to treat all those as debt.
Okay.
When they did that, our debt to GDP rose from 75% to 105%. 105% debt to GDP ratio.
Okay.
And the condition for us to qualify for a loan was for us to reduce that 105% debt to GDP to 55%.
Okay.
So that's where the haircut started coming.
All right.
So it's not just about increasing your revenue or managing your debt. You also have to manage your debt.
Okay.
It has to be sustainable.
It has to be sustainable.
Yes.
Okay. Still on the topic of the economy and what a government must do to ensure that Ghanaians are able to live comfortable lives. The successor at the Trade Ministry has recently said that he would he's looking to introduce a bill that would control the prices of cement. Now, this has been met with a lot of disagreements, a pushback from stakeholders in the industry. Yeah. Just briefly, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, very quickly, you know, the problem with cement, like petroleum products, is that it has a multiply effect on the economy. When prices of cement or prices of petroleum products go up, you find that there's a ripple effect on other prices in the economy. Now, it ought always not to be the case, but somehow that's the way our economy is structured. Now, anytime you have an imported product, which in this case cement is, cement has about 90% or 85 to 90% imported raw material, which is the clinker. So in a sense, because of the high import content of cement, anytime the cedi depreciates, then it has an effect on
production.
Not just on production, but on the cost. Because, you know, it's just economic logic,
of course,
that if you are importing, let's say, clinker at $3 per ton, of course, because now the cedi has depreciated. If the cedi was at 10 cedis to $1, and then it depreciated from 10 to 15 cedis to $1.
Okay.
That means that if you import clinker, you'd have to pay a higher price.
Okay.
So that's the arithmetic.
Okay, so I just want to find out if you are in support of the controlled price.
Yeah.
But we need a bill to control the pricing of cement or not.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that if you solve the fundamental problem, you don't need to control prices, because the reason why you don't need to get to that point.
We are at that point now.
Yeah, no, but what I'm saying is that can easily be resolved. When you legislate
pricing,
when you legislate pricing, then you are also affecting the market structure, because we have opted in our country now for free market operation. It doesn't mean that there's no regulation, but once you get into a regime of price control, then it also has its implications. So
the argument is that the petroleum industry, the pricing in the petroleum industry is controlled. Yeah. And so same should be done for the cement industry as well.
Yeah, when you say it's controlled, it is not controlled in the way that the current proposal would deal with.
Okay.
Because you see, in the case, there's a price build-up structure. And the same thing with petroleum.
Yeah.
In the case of petroleum, if the cedi depreciates, it has an effect on this.
Okay.
So what I have proposed to deal with this is that there are certain strategic commodities, petroleum or petroleum products. Point, just to complete on that. The second point is that you can still have administrative control. Okay. So I would propose more of an administrative control than a legislative control, because when I was in government, we had an agreement with the industry that any time that there are changes in the structure of their production pricing, we need to meet the government and the industry.
And Georgia before.
And then agree on a price. So it's almost like regulation.
Okay.
But
with stakeholder consultation.
With stakeholder consultation.
That's
and at that point, you don't need to
impose
of legislation.
Yeah. All right. Now, still on the economy, just before we go to governance, we know that Dr. Bawumia, as head of the economic management team, has said time and time again, or rather he has sought to dissociate himself from the economic woes that we face as a country, because, to use his own words, he said he was just a driver's mate. Do you think that this is proper? I mean, he was not in charge, as he has said. He was, or he is just vice president. And so the buck stops with the president, as the president said. Can he dissociate himself from the woes that we have suffered economically?
Unfortunately, I don't think that he can. And my advice to my younger brother and former colleague is that he ought not to making those comments. We're all in government. I think, to be fair to the current president, he gave the vice president all the authority to manage the economy, or let's say to direct the economic governance of our country. Of course, in collaboration with ministers. Yeah. But you see, the way I see the presidency is one ticket. And it's president and vice president.
Yeah.
A vice president is not like a minister. And particularly when so much power is vested in a vice president because of what is perceived to be his area of competence, then I don't think it is appropriate for the vice president, knowing exactly the control that he had and the contribution he made to, for him now to say that he was not or he's not. But if that were the case, then it's a very serious matter that if you're vice president and you didn't have either the power or even the control of what you had been asked to undertake, then it doesn't add up.
All right. Let's talk about your social services cluster, sir. Okay. Under social services, you have education and education infrastructure. Now, a lot of calls have been made by stakeholders in the education space about the free SHS and how it has been implemented. Some have said that for people who can pay, they should be allowed to pay. People should pay for boarding houses, or perhaps the modules that are currently being run are not to the best interest of the children, seeing as they stay at home for so long and then they come for a short period and go back for so long. But one of the reasons for this is because of inadequate educational infrastructure. How do you hope to solve this problem?
Let me say from the onset now that the free SHS policy is a good policy. It's a progressive policy in the sense that you are seeking to provide an opportunity for all citizens, regardless of their background, to have access at least to second cycle education. And you know, education provides a ladder for mobility in society. And no child ought to be obstructed in his or her path to the future by the lack of means. And that's why, in principle, the free SHS program is a positive one. It's the same thing as you have with basic education. And you know, it's actually guaranteed in the Constitution. Now, the unfortunate thing, though, is that we need to look at the implementation and the operationalization of the free SHS. So what I have proposed is that we need to undertake an assessment of the management and operations of the free SHS.
Do you think it's been a success so far?
We need to retain it, but we need to make an assessment of how it has been managed and operationalized. First, in terms of the financial sustainability. Second, in terms of the infrastructural requirements. Third, in terms of the curriculum for the free SHS.
Okay.
Fourth, in terms of the capacity for teachers to contribute to the success of it. And last but not the least, we need to evaluate it based on the transition from SHS to tertiary education and then into the world of life. So you need to do that comprehensive review. So you retain it, but it has to be reviewed along these lines.
All right, awesome. Now, finally, under your governance cluster, you talk about corruption. And if I understand what I read correctly, you're looking to replace the special prosecutor with a special anti-corruption czar.
Yeah.
It's a I want to say it's a nice name for who the overlord of fighting corruption is going to be, an anti-corruption czar.
Anti-corruption overlord.
Overlord.
Yes.
Right.
But,
how is he? What's he going to do differently from what the special prosecutor does? And why are you looking to replace the office of the special prosecutor?
Let me again put it in context. There are 4 or 5 different entry points into dealing with corruption. One is leadership. The second is legislation. The third is the institutional arrangements to deal with corruption. And then also there's the advocacy part of it.
Okay.
Now, right now, if you look from a legislation point of view, we have different legislation that is supposed to deal with corruption. The Office of the Special Prosecutor, that legislation is supposed to deal with corruption. But IOCO also is supposed to deal with corruption.
Yeah.
Siraj is supposed to deal with corruption. See, all these pieces of legislation that are designed to deal with corruption conflict with each other. So our proposal is to consolidate all these different legislation into one enabling legislation and then appoint this overlord. So it is different because currently the special prosecutor derives his authority from
the Attorney
General. And it doesn't help support the power of the special prosecutor. So we are proposing that the authority assigned to the overlord in our proposal must not be dependent on the authority of the Attorney General. And so you are creating a whole new regime for dealing with corruption, which is different from what we have now. But I've told you also know that it's about political will, not just at the level of the president, but also to deal with political appointees.
How do you think we've done so far under this administration?
We haven't done well enough because the numbers show. If you look at the indexes.
The Corruption Perception Index.
Yes, Corruption Perception Index. And the NDC did not do better either. So you can see that currently there's a struggle between the two parties who has been more corrupt. So obviously that is not something.
But your administration will not tolerate corruption at all. Because
I've given very comprehensive, specific proposals for dealing with corruption.
Okay.
And I believe that that is the way to go.
That is the way to go. Can I have a copy?
Oh, very much so.
Right.
I can give you an autographed
oh, well,
copy.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. And,
thank you so much.
I recommend it not only to you, but to all Ghanaians.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, please do.
Of course, you hope to win the December 7 elections, but if you don't, would you be open to giving this great transformational plan to whoever becomes president? Because it seems like a very comprehensive plan on how to turn our country around.
Now, I've already indicated that this is a blueprint for Ghana's transformation.
So it's for all of us.
So it's for Ghana. But just on a concluding note, there's a certain spirituality about leadership that defies political logic. And this is where I am coming from. And you know, I've been around in this game, but I've been very patient. And, you know, God does things in his own good time. So yes, I know that once the December election is on, God's glory will be manifested. And I'll be the first independent candidate to become president.
All right.
Because the time calls for such a person.
All right. Very well said. I've enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it too.
Thank you so much for coming. And we wish you all the best.
Thank you.
We'll see you at the swearing in.
Very well, very well. I will connect.
Yes, sir. Okay. Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's our time. Thank you so much for watching TV3 New Day today. My name is Na Ashokor. We'll be back tomorrow at 6 a.m. Goodbye.